Ever so much, Joseph and Rachel. Good to be with all of you. Um, I think I've got about 20 minutes, so I really am going to just give a scattergun approach, and some of it may well perhaps land with different ones of you in different places, different situations you're in. Other bits will not be particularly relevant, but I've just got a kind of a number of thoughts that I thought I would bring. So the question is, what will engaging outreach look like as we hopefully come out of the pandemic and begin to see the new landscape, and begin to find across the nations of Europe more and more opportunities for us to start engaging again with planting churches and reaching people with the gospel. What might that landscape look like? I think the first thing to say is that the two biggest areas of depletion for the church in the West over the last, well, probably during my lifetime, have been the decline in corporate prayer and the decline in personal and collective witnessing. And when those two things start to go down, then inevitably the health and well-being of church life over time also begins to go down. And I don't think that whatever the next landscape looks like, we're looking for a set of events or a set of techniques or a set of, kind of, this is the latest thing that's going to do it. I believe we're going to have to invest in a culture change rather than a program change. And a culture change is slow, it's persistent, it's hard work. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of time going in a certain direction until people generally begin to think differently, not just behave in a different way in a short term. And that applies to leaders, it applies to myself. I'm preaching this to myself possibly more than anybody even on the rest of the call, because these are things I'm having to grapple with personally. Within our own journey as Relational Mission, we embarked on a desire to try and address the culture of corporate prayer amongst us. And for the last 7 years, we've been investing in the prayers of many, as we call it. There's been events around it called Enough, which have been a bit like headline grabbers just to draw some involvement. But those events in themselves were never the end. They were always just a means to the end, which is to try and address the culture amongst the churches that corporate prayer actually needs to become the engine room of everything we do, rather than a department or an optional extra if you happen to be a particularly enthusiastic Christian. And it's changing a culture. And we've been doing that 7 years. And I would say we have made a dent in the culture. But I would not say, even as yet, we've completely transformed the culture. It's a significant dent, and it has affected the atmosphere. It's affected the way we think now, I think, across all the churches. But even after 7 years, I think we've still got yet much more of a way to go. And I believe that that kind of a journey is going to be necessary with the same kind of tenacity and thought to witnessing, to sharing the gospel, to what we would call everyone a witness. We're trying to have a hashtag prayers of many and a hashtag everyone a witness, because we're trying to change a culture so that everybody sees. It's not about bringing the evangelists in to do their thing and everybody applauds. It's not about bringing in a specialist kind of team or a specialist program. It's about every single one of us having a deep change within how we perceive and think and act and behave and talk within the world around us, a genuine culture change. So some of the things I think that maybe we would need to just look for, I think there are things that God is beginning to do in the pandemic and through it. Certainly this pandemic, I do believe there is a providence of God upon it in terms of gospel fruitfulness that will come from it. I think if anything, the headline is people are more open to the gospel now as a result of the pandemic rather than closed to it, because I think it's shaken everybody. There's a trauma that has affected everybody in every nation, because suddenly we are out of control. And particularly in the West, people have lived their lives feeling in control, feeling that they are the masters of their own destiny. We are all now in a situation where that is not the case. It never was the case, but we, for some reason, seem to think it was. We now realize that isn't the case. So a few thoughts. I was talking to Angela Kem recently about something completely different, unrelated to this, and she happened to mention a verse, Matthew 13:52, and it stuck with me as really relevant to this whole thing of witness. And the verse says, Jesus said to them, therefore, every scribe or teacher or leader, every leader, let's put that word in there, every leader who's been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of the house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. So good leadership, when we think about what might engaging outreach look like, good leadership involves bringing out old things and bringing out new things. The gospel is very old. Church planting is very old. These things are the bread and butter of the Christian life. They're the bedrock of outreach, that people are saved and added. They're very old, but there's very new things that we can also add into that in terms of the style, the way, the context, the way that we actually apply things. Even I would suggest there may be new things that as yet none of us have ever experienced before. They may be, when it says they're new, it might mean not new as in only relatively recently discovered. It might mean we've never done this before. It's quite possible, I believe, that something completely new may, or a number of things may begin to break out, and we will have to navigate our way through them and thinking, is this all right? Are we allowed to do this? This seems very, very new. Can you teach an old dog new tricks? Well, we'll find out as the coming days go ahead. But I do think we need to have both new ways, new styles, but yet the gospel and church planted, the gospel doesn't change, and we've got to keep the plumb line absolutely cross-centered, Christ-centered, repentance-centered, new birth-centered, authority of Scripture-centered. Those things don't change. And I think with regard to that, we can learn from Paul walking around Athens, who spent a lot of time walking around looking, and he said, I can see that you are. He observed, he talked, he listened, he respectfully engaged. And within the different nations of Europe, there is a vast difference between every nation. We can't just say Europe as a thing. It's just such a smorgasbord, if I can use a Scandinavian phrase. It's a smorgasbord of cultures and histories, and even linguistic things will affect how people engage with the gospel. So we've got to do a lot of listening and a lot of respectful engagement with people, I think, in the next phase, because it will give us clues as to how best to engage with them. One of the things I do feel that is beginning to happen, particularly in the Middle East, but I think will happen more and more in the nations of Europe, is a rediscovery of the Bible. I think simple reading the Bible, I think many non-Christians, the Bible sales have gone up hugely through the pandemic, because I think people are searching, and they search where they turn to the Bible. So simple things, I think some of the Discovery Bible Study things that have been emerging, simple Bible-based, very, very easily accessible things, I think that will begin to become a primary tool. Simply giving people Bibles again. Remember, the old Gideons, I mean, they're still going, but the Gideons have seen many people come to Christ simply by leaving New Testaments in hotel rooms or giving them out at schools or businesses or whatever. Let's not, this might be one of the old things we pull out. So actually, you've got questions about life, read this, read the Bible. Here's a Gideon's Testament, whatever. I think that will come through, as will basic, simple discipleship, lifestyle, words, thoughts, deeds, beliefs, with great patience. We may have to engage in the ones and the twos in order to reach the many, and that will be time well spent. I think another thing that maybe I would just, this perhaps is a little provocative amongst our kind of movement, but I'll leave it with you, see what you think. I think it might be a mistake for us to wait collectively to kind of sort out the church post-COVID before we get involved in outreach. At the moment, there could be such a distraction of our time thinking, how do we do the meetings? Is it masks on, masks off? What about the children? What about this group? What about that? So many questions for those who are involved in running church meetings. And all of those things are very valid. But we could find ourselves drawn down a rabbit hole of administrative management issues that actually we can't solve because, I don't know, 2 months later, there'll be some COVID thing or some other thing that means we have to change what we're doing. I think the reason I'm raising this is that we are in a period of shaking. The world is in a period of shaking. And I don't think COVID is the only shaking. I think there is a lot of things going to be shaken. Why? Because it's God's intention that at the end of it, only the thing that cannot be shaken will remain. And that all the confidence people have in everything else, even our confidence and reliance, perhaps even in church structures, will be shaken, because the only thing that cannot be shaken is Christ, his kingdom, and the gospel. And those are the things that will become prominent. And if we were to just focus on sorting out managerial things, I think we would miss an opportunity. There is an opportunity now, a moment, a little window of openness in people's hearts where they are very, very, I think, open to the gospel because they've been traumatized by COVID. And it occurred to me recently, I had a chat the other day with Gavin Calver, who runs the Evangelical Alliance. And I would just say, for those of you in the UK, I think Gavin's doing an excellent job with the Evangelical Alliance. I'd really encourage us to get behind him. The direction he's taking it is so gospel-centered. I think he deserves big applause and much support. And I had a chance to chat to him and meet him the other day, and just to say, look, as Relational Mission, we want to support you in any way we can. And I would encourage personal membership of the EA and getting involved churches-wise, just to add our voice. It's very important. But one of the things he said is, he just caught me, something he mentioned, that, when Philip went and shared with the Ethiopian who was on his way back down, to Africa, Philip didn't think to himself, now, how am I going to follow him up when he gets there? There was no thought of that. He just shared the gospel with him in obedience to God's prompting. And Peter, on the day of Pentecost, when he preached and several thousand were saved, did he have a follow-up plan in place at the time he did it? Probably not. When the scattering that happened because of the persecution following Stephen's death, this great scattering, and church was dispersed, and there may have been churches in people's homes. We don't know. It's 10 years between Acts 8 and Acts 11. It's 10 years before there's anything public of any church structures that is noted in the book of Acts. Antioch emerges in Acts 11, but that was a 10-year journey. And yet the gospel flourished, even with, if you like, management inability to structure anything visibly above ground. And I just think there's something about a kind of a raw pioneering, we don't know how to deal with this, we just want to get some people saved and then we'll figure it out later. I think that kind of cultural thinking perhaps needs to be more deeply embedded in us than perhaps it was going into the pandemic. Remember that Paul also said, by all means, save some. Use any method. Anything is valid. If it gets people to come to Christ, use it. And I sometimes watch on the internet or various things, lots of debates and things about, there's this method is the key method. And I've been doing this long enough to know there's always the next thing that comes along, the next conference, the next book, the next idea. And they're all great. They're all valid. By all means, save some. But I think it would, again, be a mistake to say we're waiting for the thing to come along that will suddenly be the thing that turns evangelism into something that's fruitful. The way evangelism will become fruitful is by everyone a witness, every one of us using words, works, and wonders, and actually tuning into our own particular sweet spot. And for those of us, most of you are pioneers, you're pioneering, you're carving something out. I would say don't wait for someone to give you the silver bullet so you think, now it'll work. Find your sweet spot. What's the thing that helps you? Now, my sweet spot is preaching. I prefer that. And I'm quite happy asking people if they want prayer or prophesying over people who are strangers or whatever. I'm happy doing that. Sometimes I find I'm not so good at the sharing of the gospel clearly with one-to-one, but I'm working at it. I'm learning. I'm finding out some good questions I can ask people. So my sweet spot of a question is, if I'm talking to someone who doesn't know the Lord, I'll say, "Do you have a faith?" I find that I find that helps me relax with whatever then comes back. Now, that may sound a simple thing, but what I'm trying to illustrate is I'm trying to find my sweet spot. I'm trying to find where's the grace of God resting on me that I can then lean into. So we've got, one or two, or I've got a neighbor nearby who needs a little bit of help with one or two things. So I cut her grass for her. And I just do that regularly. In the pandemic, we did her shopping, begin to share one or two things about the church and faith and things. I'm just leaving the door open. She's not like receiving much of that at the moment. She's just a bit cautious, but I'm just hanging in there. I'm hanging in there. I'm finding a sweet spot, somewhere I can just lean in and be in proximity. And I think for all of us, we've just got to find our sweet spot. Where is it that God is just giving us little edges of, I don't know, where we can just sense a little bit of faith to press in a little bit more with people. I would also observe that the story that has been resonating quite a lot about Acts 27, where the ship broke up, and I think the image of the church breaking up, all the structures breaking up, and everybody just bobbing about in the water, thinking what happens next, and then finally arrive on the island of Malta. I think there is a prophetic significance about that story, and even the arriving on Malta. What was really interesting to me, was just reading it again recently, is when Paul and all the others arrived on Malta, they didn't do a campaign, they didn't plant the church, they didn't establish small groups. They lit a fire together with the community. It was unbelievers and believers working together to solve a common problem. And I do wonder whether, even coming out of the pandemic, rather than us feeling we're arriving, here we are, everybody, we've got all the answers to all of life and the world's problems, I think we might find that actually non-Christians might even help us with some of the things that we personally need. That can be just as good a way of getting a connection with someone as arriving as the answer. It says the islanders showed them great hospitality. They cared for them. They looked after them. They weren't Christians. They was just helping people in need. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's much more of a kind of a collective community effort that comes from Christians and non-Christians actually working together to solve common problems in their communities. That will lead to friendships, relationships, leads to other doors. You remember in that story, Publius, who was the governor, he heard, the relationship was built, and he invited them to come and pray for one of his relatives who was unwell, because they just knit hearts together. There was something they'd had to do together to build a fire because it was raining and cold. They all needed warmth. So just throwing out a few things there for you. I'll give you a few more, and hopefully the ones that land with you, you can just jot down. Ones that you don't worry about it. I think that for me personally, and I guess for all of us, when you come to change a culture, you have to change a lifestyle. You have to change your lifestyle. Some years ago, I found out I'd got slightly high cholesterol. Not, sort of worryingly so, but a trend was developing that I needed to do something about it. So I had to go on a lifestyle change to adjust my diet so that my lifestyle would be in keeping with what I wanted to achieve. In other words, that my cholesterol would come down. It took me about 2 years to get that about right, so that now it's okay at the moment. And I think the same thing is true for everyone a witness. The same thing is true for us all becoming effective witnesses. We have to go through a lifestyle change in just the same way as if you're trying to adjust something medically, so you're healthier. You have to go through spiritually some adjustments so that we're more spiritually fit for purpose and healthy. And for me, it means making some adjustments so that I personally become more effective as a witness. Because if I do that, then I think that helps then create a culture across where I have responsibility for leading. And I think that's part of what being a Christian is, to share the gospel with people in season, out of season, not just evangelists or people who are wired that way. Every one of us should be sharing the gospel. So I needed to make some adjustments. And I think in one way that can help churches, if you've got like a small pioneering group, or if you've got a slightly bigger church, or if you're in a bigger church and you're wanting to then explore more outreach, I can't overstate how important and energizing good stories are. Just to hear a good story of someone sharing their faith and someone either coming to Christ or just some positive impact in their life from that step, or even someone sharing, I had a go, but it didn't really work very well, but at least I had a go. What those stories do is they create an atmosphere where people feel, oh, this is actually what we're all doing now. We all need to get involved in this. It creates an atmosphere, and atmospheres create momentum. Momentum doesn't come without atmosphere. You have to get atmosphere first to create momentum. So stories, feedback, everybody kind of getting excited about something, intentional, bringing that as front and center of everything we do, so that just as we did with corporate prayer, we just keep talking about that, keep talking about it, keep talking about it. Gradually, everybody thinks like that. With witnessing, share stories, share stories, share stories, having a go, success, failure, tried this was helpful. That will create an atmosphere which will create momentum, which ultimately then creates culture change. So I think those things seem to me to be really important. Last few things, as I started a bit late, so I'm going to pinch just the last few minutes out of my late start. I'll lean into that. Things to do are to watch for and expect the leading of God. So having listened to what I've said, it could have the effect of us all running around like headless chickens, all having a go at everything and getting exhausted. I'm not saying do that. Please don't do that. This is supposed to be fun. It can be fun to share the gospel and not driven. It's not a drivenness I'm advocating. I'm just saying there's lots of new things to think about. But in the midst of that, individually and as churches, we have to watch for and expect that God will lead us to individuals, to certain things to do, put our energies into, to places to go, etc., etc. The leading of God can be seen in the book of Acts, where Philip with the chariot, even with the dispersal following following Stephen's martyrdom, you can see the providence of God in dispersing what was becoming a very large centered church, dispersing it to get the gospel out. You can see God's leading in it. So expect Macedonian calls. Expect God to say, go over and stand, well, not by that chariot. I don't think any of you have got chariots where you're living, but go over by that bus stop. Go and stand by that bus stop. Go into that supermarket. Talk to that person over there. Pay for that lady shopping who's standing in the queue in front of you. Do something outrageous. Expect those moments. I can remember a neighbor nearby to me who came out of her house, and she looked very, very sad. And I said, oh, what's wrong? And I can't remember what she said now, but it was quite sad, something had happened. And I said, would it be all right if I just prayed for you? And she said, yes, that's fine. So I prayed and I prophesied over. I felt God give me a word for her. And I said to her, does that mean anything to you? And she said, well, I don't really know whether it meant anything to me, but the thing was, at least I know you care. And the thing that impacted her was the fact that I'd stopped and taken time to pray and prophesy over her, and she was crying. God was obviously touching her in some way. Now, I was expecting her to say, wow, that prophecy was incredible. You've just read my entire life. But she said, I can't remember much about what you said, but it showed me that you care. So just go with it. Go when God nudges you. And we have to live attentive to that, thinking, right, I'm waiting, Lord, for you to give me some direction here. I think there will also, I think if I can put this prophetically, I think there will also be a return to, as it were, gospel gatherings, like the lecture hall of Tyrannus that Paul was in for 2 years. I think there will come revival roadshows, if you call it like that, preaching either in the open air or in targeted gospel contexts across Europe. I think we will see the day coming where the gospel will be preached and people will respond in gathering to the proclaimed gospel. That's something old, but I think it could be something new in the future. I think that day will come. I do believe. Work in plurality wherever possible. Jesus sent people out in twos, two by two. It's much easier to, if you're a bit nervous or you're a bit unsure about, witnessing, have someone with you. I think that's what Jesus did. He sent them out in twos to learn, and that's something we can learn from as well. And the last thing to say is, I think particularly with this be a pioneering conference, I would say keep it very simple. A church plant can really look like someone coming into your home, you're doing a little Bible study with them, or meeting them in a cafe, just going through a discovery Bible study thing. It can be very, very, very simple. It doesn't need to have an articulated lorry of setup and PA and bang, chairs in lines. We don't have to get overwhelmed with the thought of planting a church. It can come from a living room. When Paul went to Philippi, there wasn't even a synagogue there. So he went to a river to find a place of prayer where he knew a few ladies who would be Jewish believers. And it says that Lydia, when he spoke to her, when he preached the gospel to this little group of ladies, the Lord opened her heart. And she said, if you consider me a believer, you can use my home. And the church at Philippi began there with a very, very simple thing. She was a businesswoman. She let her home. She let perhaps her business wealth be available. And as a result of that, when you read the letter to Philippians in the New Testament later on, the epistle, we realize there's a burgeoning church there that starts simply with him sharing his faith with Lydia, and the Lord opened her heart. So small beginnings of seeing people come to Christ can lead, and I think should be, the seedbed of pioneering right across Europe in different nations. Right, I've had my time, done.